In a valley that had been losing things for years, water, land, money, one woman... The room had just finished laughing. She signed the deed with both hands pressed flat so no one could see them shaking.
Across the room, one man had stopped laughing before the others. He was already making different calculations.
Nobody in that room knew what was buried under 55 acres of poison ivy. Nobody except him.
The auctioneer hadn't even finished reading the lot number when the laughter started. Not quiet, snickering, not polite smiles hidden behind hands. Full, open, shoulder-shaking laughter. The kind that all courthouse and bounces off linoleum floors and follows a woman all the way to her truck. Vera Callahan stood at the back of the room with her bidding paddle still raised, her jaw set so tight her back teeth ached, and she thought about the $111 in her checking account and the 55 acres of poison ivy and wild vines she had just purchased with most of it. And she thought about the man in the good jacket who had let it go too easily, and she did not look at Roy Stanton, whose laughter was the loudest and most comfortable of all, the laughter of a man who had never once in his life suspected he might be wrong about something. She folded her paddle, tucked it under her arm, walked to the clerk's table, wrote a check for $111, signed the transfer paperwork with her hands, pressed flat against the surface so nobody could see them shaking, and then she walked out in the cold November air of Grover Falls, Colorado, and stood beside her truck for a moment with the deed in her hand, and the sound of Roy Stanton's laughter still warm in her ears. That was the middle of the story. Here is the beginning. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. The same morning, Vera found the third dead chicken that week. She was standing in the dirt outside the coop with the bird hanging from her hand, still warm, when she heard the mail truck roll down the gravel lane and stop. She didn't move. She stood there, holding the dead chicken and looking at nothing in particular, thinking about the $340 she had already spent on the veterinarian this month, and the $1,200 still due on the feed loan she had taken out in March. The sun wasn't even fully up. The mountains to the west were still the dark purple color they turned before the light reached them. The mailbox flag went up. The truck drove away. She laid the chicken carefully on the fence post. She would bury it later, after coffee, after she figured out what had gotten into the coop. She walked to the mailbox. The envelope was from Piedmont Savings and Loan in Grover Falls, and she knew what it was before she opened it. She had been knowing for 3 months. Final notice of default. Amount past due, $4,847. If payment is not received in full within 30 days, foreclosure proceedings went on the following property. She read it twice, folded it back along its original creases, and walked to the kitchen. She put the kettle on. She sat down at the table, the same table Dean had built from ponderosa pine their first winter together, sanded so many times over the years it was smooth as skin, and she put her face in her hands, and she did not cry. She was past crying. She was somewhere on the other side of crying, in that flat gray country where things just feel like facts. Dean had been gone 14 months. He died the way strong men sometimes do, fast, without warning, without any of the slow preparation that might have given her time to learn the parts of the ranch he had always handled. The cattle breeding records, the equipment maintenance schedule, the relationship with the bank manager, a man named Collins, who had known Dean since high school and had always been willing to talk. Collins retired 6 weeks after Dean's funeral. His replacement was a woman named Carla Nash, 32 years old, sharp as cut glass, and absolutely not interested in Senta history. The loan was the loan, the number was the number. Vera understood. She didn't hold it against Carla Nash. She just didn't have the money. The ranch was 412 acres in the wide basin of Sagebrush Flats Valley, tucked into the southwestern corner of Colorado, where the land ran red and dry and the sky in summer felt close enough to touch. Or it had been 412 acres until she sold the east pasture to pay off Dean's medical bills. Then the strip along the highway to cover the estate tax. Then the 2 parcels on the North Ridge to make it through last winter. What remained was 160 acres. The house, the barn, the outbuildings, and a cattle operation that had been shrinking since the day she started managing it alone. She had 32 cows. She had 91 18 months ago. She understood in the abstract that she was losing. She understood it the way you understand weather, intellectually and completely, without quite believing it applies to you too. The county foreclosure auction notice came 3 weeks later, taped to the community board outside the hardware store in Grover Falls. She almost missed it. She had driven to town for a box of staples and some baling wire, and she was walking back to her truck when the yellow paper caught her eye. She stood on the sidewalk and read the whole list. 23 properties, small parcels, back lots, the kind of land nobody wanted and nobody paid taxes on until the county got tired of waiting. Item 17 stopped her. Lot 1755, 4 acres, Section 9, Township 23S, Range 67W, unimproved, no road access of record. Back taxes due, $1,984. Minimal bid, $100. She knew that parcel. Everybody in Sagebrush Flats Valley knew that parcel the way you know a scar, by sight and not by touch. It occupied the whole western slope of the ridge above Clearbone Creek, a solid green mass of vegetation so dense and aggressive that the county road crews had given up trying to clear the fence line along its edge back in 1994. The problem wasn't just the overgrowth. The problem was what the overgrowth was made of. Poison ivy and Virginia creeper and wild sumac stacked 3 and 4 and sometimes 6 feet high, with a canopy of volunteer cedar and chokecherry overhead, the whole mess sealed together like a wall. People said there was an old cabin somewhere in there, but nobody had seen it in living memory. People said a lot of things about that parcel. Mainly, they said nobody's ever going to do anything with that. Vera took a photograph of the notice with her phone and drove home. She spent 2 evenings researching, and not on the internet. Her satellite connection was too slow and unreliable for anything serious, and she had learned to distrust information that came too easily. On Thursday morning, she drove to the county library in Grover Falls and asked the librarian, a woman named Patricia Wren, who had been working there since 1979, whether she could look at the historical land records for Section 9. Patricia looked at her over her reading glasses. The Clearbone Creek parcel? Vera said yes. You buying it? I'm thinking about it. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Something moved across her face that was not quite surprise and not quite calculation, more like the particular alertness of a person who has spent 40 years in a room full of answers and has just been asked the right question. Come on back, she said, and led Vera to the records room. What Vera found across 3 hours of squinting at microfilm and handwritten ledgers was this. The parcel had been homesteaded in 1887 by a family named Grantham. It had passed through 3 before the last recorded owner, a man named Howard Pelch, simply stopped paying taxes on it in 1987 and apparently walked away. Nobody had purchased it since. Nobody had touched it. But the original homestead survey, filed in 1889, drawn in faded brown ink, showed something she hadn't expected. There was a creek, not Clearbone Creek itself, which ran along the bottom of the valley, but a tributary, unnamed on all subsequent maps, that cut through the upper third of the parcel. Spring-fed, the original surveyor had noted in his cramped handwriting, reliable, does not dry in drought year. She sat back in her chair. A reliable spring in southwestern Colorado, in a valley that had been watching its water table drop for 15 years, was not nothing. A reliable spring was not nothing at all. But it was the second document that stopped her completely. In a hand-typed index compiled by a local historian named Walter Briggs before his death in the 1970s, a single line about the earliest known settler of the Upper Valley, Brant Elias. Credited locally as first permanent settler in Upper Clearbone Creek drainage, his cabin, constructed c. 1863, was the site of the first 1864-65. Location now uncertain. Location now uncertain. She read the line 3 times. Patricia read it beside her. The 2 women looked at each other across the table, the basement records room, with its bad fluorescent lighting and its smell of old paper. And something passed between the particular recognition of something that had been lost a long time and might just have been found if they were reading what they thought they were reading. Until now, Vera said. Patricia took her glasses off. Until now, she agreed. Vera drove home with the survey documents photocopied in a folder on the passenger seat. She did the math as she drove, not about the spring, not yet, but about the minimum bid, $100. She had $111 left in her checking account. She had just enough to bid, and just enough for one counter bid of $1, and then she was done. She didn't tell anyone she was going. The courthouse in Grover Falls was a 2-story building of pale brick that smelled of floor, wax, and old paper, and the particular bureaucratic exhaustion of a place where people came when things had gone wrong. The auction room held perhaps 80 people comfortably, and on the morning of the sale it held closer to 100, because item 3 on the list was the old Weston Mill property on the river, and 3 different development groups were competing for it. The energy in the room was the charged, circulating energy of money in motion, and Vera felt it as soon as she walked in. She knew most of the faces. She had grown up in this valley, married into it, buried her husband in it. She nodded to people. Some nodded back. Some looked at her with the specific kind of careful politeness people reserve for widows in their first 2 years, as though grief were a condition that required a certain handling. Roy Stanton was there. Roy ran 600 head on the prime bottomland west of town and had for 30 years, and he had the settled authority of a man whose land and cattle and standing in the community had never once been seriously questioned. He had told Dean once at a 4th of July barbecue that a woman couldn't run a cattle operation alone, said it cheerfully, as a simple statement of fact, the way you might say it always rains in April. Dean had laughed it off. Vera had not forgotten. Roy's son Travis was with him, 26 years old, and already wearing his father's expression, that permanent mild amusement at the way the world arranged itself to conflict everything he already believed. There was also a man Vera didn't recognize. He was perhaps 50, sitting on the left side of the room in the third row, wearing a jacket that was too good for this room. Not flashy, not conspicuous, but the kind of quality that sounds it itself to anyone who knows what they're looking at. He had the stillness of someone who had done this before, at auctions like this one in counties like this one, and who was not here because he had to be, but because something had brought him specifically. She filed him away and found a seat near the back. The auction moved quickly through the first several items. The Weston Mill property sold for $340,000 after a spirited back and forth that had the room buzzing. Several smaller parcels for modest amounts. Then the auctioneer reached item 17. He read the description in the flat, practiced monotone of a man who had been doing this for 30 years. 55.4 acres, no road access, back taxes due. Minimum bid, $100. He looked up. This is the clear-bone poison ivy parcel for those who aren't familiar. A small smile. Any interest at 100? Silence? Someone laughed very quietly. Vera raised her paddle. The auctioneer blinked. He had not expected that. I have 100. Do I have 110? Silence. Then the man in the good jacket, without changing his posture, without any particular energy, 110. Vera turned to look at him. Something moved across his face when their eyes met. Something that was not amusement and not contempt, but closer to recalculation. The expression of a person who has just been presented with new information and is deciding what to do with it. He held her gaze for exactly the length of time it took to finish whatever he was thinking, and then he looked away. 111, Vera said. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something unexpected happens. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of attention, everyone pausing to see what this was. The auctioneer waited. Do I have 120? He looked at the man in the jacket. The man had settled back in his chair with the easy confident who had stopped participating, not because he couldn't, but because he had decided not to. Going once at 111, going twice. The gavel came down. Sold. $111. That was when Roy Stanton turned around. He turned slowly with the comfortable authority of a man who owned the movement, that wide grin spreading across his face. Honey. He said it loud enough for 2 rows to hear on either side. You just bought yourself a pile of itch. The laughter came in a wave. Not everyone, maybe a third of the room, but it was the particular kind of laughter that functions as a verdict. The sound of people confirming something they had already decided about you. Travis Stanton's shoulders shook. A woman near the front covered her mouth. Someone made a comment Vera couldn't quite hear, and whoever was next to him laughed harder. Vera folded her paddle. She tucked it under her arm. She walked to the clerk's table, wrote the check, pressed her hands flat against the surface while she signed the transfer paperwork, and then she walked out. She sat in her truck for a long time before she started the engine. The man in the good jacket had bid to 110 and then stopped. That was the thing that sat with her on the drive home, more than Roy Stanton's laughter, more than the specific humiliation of being laughed at in a room full of people who had known her most of her adult life. A man in a jacket like that didn't drive from wherever he had driven from to let 55 acres of anything go for a single dollar. People with resources and reasons didn't make mistakes like that. They made calculations, and calculations that looked like mistakes usually weren't. He had stopped because he thought he could get it another way. She didn't know what that meant yet. She pulled off the county road onto the dirt track that led to the stock pond Dean had dug in 1998, turned the engine off, and sat looking at the water. It was lower than it should have been for November, which it had been all year. Everything was lower than it should be. The water table, her bank account, her confidence in her own judgment. There was a spring in the upper third of that parcel that didn't dry in drought years. A surveyor had written that down in 1889, and nobody had contested it in the documents she'd found. She put the truck in gear and drove home. 3 weeks after the auction, she was at a small livestock sale in Grover Falls, looking but not buying, when she fell into conversation with a woman named June Whitmore. June ran a small operation outside of town and had for decades the kind of unhurried competence that comes from having survived enough bad years to stop being surprised by them. They were leaning on a fence watching a pen of boar crosses move through the ring, and Vera mentioned the parcel, mostly just to have something to say. She described the vegetation, the layers of it, the poison ivy and the sumac and the wall of vine, so thick you couldn't see 20 feet into it. June looked at her. Boar crosses, she said. Vera waited. Goats, they'll eat that stuff down to the ground. Poison ivy doesn't bother goats. Neither does sumac. You throw enough goats at a hillside like that, they'll strip it clean in a season, maybe 2. Vera stared at her. You're serious? Goat brush clearing's been a thing for 20 years. People rent herds out for it. June shrugged with the economy of someone who had already done the work of being interested in things and was offering the results. Problem is, you need enough animals to make a dent and enough time to let them work, and you need to keep them pen tight so they move through systematic and don't just scatter. How many goats for 55 acres of heavy overgrowth? June thought about it with the specific deliberation of a person doing real arithmetic. 60. 80 might be better. Vera did her own math. It didn't work with the money she had. It might work with the money she could put together if she sold the last 4 heifers she had been planning to keep for breeding stock. And if she took the small equipment loan she had been avoiding, and if nothing went wrong for the next 8 months, which was a lot of conditions to stack on top of each other. Where would I find 60 goats? She said. June smiled. It was a small private smile, the kind that suggested she had known where this conversation was going before it started. I might know a few people. It took 6 weeks. Vera bought 37 goats in the end, not 60, because that was what she could afford, and because she had decided somewhere along the way that doing something imperfectly was better than waiting for perfect conditions that were never going to arrive. 22 were boar crosses, big aggressive browsers that could eat through almost anything. 15 were a mixed assortment assembled from 3 different small farms across the county, part Spanish, part Kiko, one animal of entirely uncertain ancestry that June referred to diplomatically as motivated. Vera named that one Franklin. He reminded her of a person she had known in high school who was notoriously impossible to discourage. It seemed like the right name. She fenced the parcel, or rather she fenced the accessible perimeter of it, which took 11 days of labor she performed mostly alone with 2 afternoons of help from Patricia's teenage grandson, who showed up unannounced one Saturday morning with a post pounder and didn't ask to be paid. She built temporary water access from a tank she hauled out twice a week. She sectioned the interior into rough paddocks using portable electronet, moving the goats every 5 to 7 days onto fresh ground, and then she waited to see if it would work. The first thing she noticed was the noise. Goats are not quiet animals. They have opinions, constant and loudly held, in tones ranging from mild complaint to existential outrage. The hillside, which had been silent for decades, sealed under its green vault, thick and muffled as insulation, began to sound for the first time in living memory like something inhabited. Vera drove out every morning before her other chores to check on them, and she learned their rhythms faster than she expected. Margaret, the largest of the boar crosses, was the undisputed authority of the herd, enforcing a social order Vera came to respect for its efficiency. The 3 young Weathers operated as a unit and were collectively responsible for approximately 40% of all problems. Franklin consistently found gaps in the electronet that should not have been possible given the basic laws of physics, and Vera stopped being angry about it sometime in December and started treating it as a given, the way you learn to treat certain kinds of weather. The work was not glamorous. She pulled a goat from a tangle of old fencing wire at 7:30 on a Sunday morning in December in a cold rain, cutting her palm on the wire and kneeling in mud. She lost a young doe in January to something the veterinarian couldn't quite pin down, probably respiratory, and she stood at the edge of the parcel in winter light and felt the specific hollow grief of livestock loss, which is not the same as any other kind of grief. It's still grief, still absence of something that was alive and is now not. She did not tell anyone about the loss. She didn't have anyone she particularly told things to anymore. She adjusted the rotation and kept going. January was brutal that year. The cold came in hard after the holidays and stayed. The kind of cold that gets into equipment and makes it fail, that splits water lines and freezes locks, and turns the simplest outdoor task into a negotiation with misery. Vera lost a water tank heater in the 3rd week of January and spent 2 days hauling water by hand until a replacement arrived from Pueblo. She found a section of goat fence down one morning after a wind event that must have hit 50 miles an hour overnight and spent half a day in temperatures that didn't reach 10 degrees repairing it. Her hands clumsy and gloves too thick for the work. Franklin escaped 4 times in January. She stopped being angry about it somewhere around the 3rd escape and arrived at a kind of philosophical acceptance, which she recognized as a change in herself that had taken longer than it should have. The 4th escape happened on a morning when the snow was falling sideways, and the thermometer outside the barn read 8 degrees. She went out to find him standing in the open yard, with the particular composure of an animal who has never once considered that his choices might cause problems for anyone else. She went after him through 6 inches of new snow, and he moved just fast enough to stay ahead of her, and somewhere on the 2nd circuit of the yard, she slipped on a patch of ice underneath the snow and went down hard on her back and lay there for a moment, looking up at the gray sky with the snow falling on her face. Franklin stopped. He turned around and looked at her. She looked at him. Then she started laughing. Real laughter, not the polite kind, but the involuntary kind that comes from somewhere below conscious thought. The kind that shakes your shoulders and makes your eyes water and sounds in the middle of a Colorado January with a goat staring at you, completely incongruous with everything around it. It was the first time she had laughed since Dean's funeral. Franklin observed her for approximately 4 more seconds, decided she posed no immediate threat to his plans, and went to find better grass. She lay in the snow a little longer than she needed to. The sky was the color of old pewter. The snow landed cold on her cheeks and melted. Somewhere below her, in the paddock on the lower slope, Margaret's voice carried through the air, authoritative and unhurried, conducting whatever business required conducting. Vera got up, brushed herself off, caught Franklin by his collar, and brought him back inside. She fixed the fence section he had used to get out, which involved gaps she genuinely had no explanation for. She went inside and made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window, drinking it. That Dean would have liked that story. She would have told him at dinner. That was what she kept running into over and over, 14 months later, these small stories that had nowhere to go now. She filed this one away with the others and drank her coffee and watched the snow. It was in February, 3 months after the auction, that she first began to see what was underneath. The goats had worked through the lower third of the parcel by then, and what they left behind was not the barren scrubland she had half expected. The soil beneath the stripped vegetation was dark and dense, rich with decades of accumulated organic matter from the leaf fall of all that growth. Native grasses were already pushing up through it, thin, tentative, but undeniably there. The land itself, now visible for the first time, had a structure she hadn't anticipated. There were terraces. Human-made terraces cut into the hillside in a pattern that was not natural, not random, the kind of terracing a farmer builds to work steep ground, to hold soil and water on a slope that would otherwise wash out. The terraces were old, very old by the look of the stonework edging them, fitted without mortar in the way that means hands and not machines, the way that means someone spent a long time and took it seriously. Vera stood on the hillside for a long time looking at the terraces. Someone had worked this land. Someone had lived here and built the things that lasted long after they were gone. She walked the exposed section from one end to the other, moving slowly, looking at the ground. Near the upper edge of the cleared area, where the goats hadn't reached yet, where the vine curtain still hung dense and impenetrable, something caught her eye. A shape that wasn't a tree. A vertical line too straight to be natural. She pushed through the last fringe of cleared brush to get closer. A chimney. Hand-laid stone, maybe 12 feet high where it still stood, broken at the top where freeze and thaw had worked on it over the decades. She put her hand on it. The stone was cold and very solid and absolutely real. "Well," she said to nobody. Her voice disappeared into the hillside. She spent 40 minutes in the area around it, moving carefully, not touching anything she didn't have to touch. The cabin itself, what remained of it, had a front wall still standing to perhaps 8 feet on the left side and collapsed to rubble on the right. The chimney rose from what had been the interior. The floor where she could see it, through the vine mat, was flat stone. The same fitted without mortar technique as the terracing. 2 window openings, no glass, no frames, just square holes in the stone that the wilderness had been trying to swallow for 60 years. She stood in what had been the doorway, because the threshold was still there, worn smooth in the middle in the way thresholds wear when enough feet have crossed them over enough years, and she looked in. Something moved in the back corner. She startled badly, one hand going to the wall, and then identified it as a pack rat who was considerably less frightened of her than she was of it. She let out a long breath. "Fair enough," she said. The hardware remnants she could see were iron hand-forged, the kind of metalwork that stopped being made around 1910. The stub ends of hand-hewn joists still protruded from the upper portion of the standing wall. The far corner, a wooden object partially collapsed under its own weight, might have been a chair or might have been a small table. She couldn't tell, and she didn't touch it. What she understood standing in that roofless cabin in the February cold was that this was old. Not old like her house, which had been built in 1932. Old like before electricity, before the county road, old like the valley's original story, whatever that was. She drove to the library that afternoon. Patricia Wren recognized her footstep now, which was either a good sign or a sign that Vera had been spending too much time in the records room. The librarian looked up when Vera came in, took in her expression, and said simply, "Found something." "A cabin," Vera said. "Stone, hand-hewn joists, iron hardware. I need the original Homestead records for that parcel again, but I also need whatever you have on early settlement in this valley before 1900. Patricia took her glasses off. She looked at Vera the way she looked at research problems, not excited exactly, but engaged. The particular focus of someone who genuinely loves finding things. "Sit down," she said. "This might take a while." It took 3.5 hours. What they assembled, pulling from the Homestead records and the county history books Patricia had been quietly collecting for 30 years, and the 2 hand-typed indexes that Walter Briggs had compiled before his death, was this. The Grantham family, who had filed the original Homestead claim in 1887, had not been the first people on that land. The original settler was a man named Elias Brandt, who had arrived in the valley in 1881, 26 years before the formal homestead filing. In the years before this part of Colorado was organized enough for official claims, he had built a cabin and worked the land on squatters' rights. By the time the Homestead Act reached this county, he had been on that hillside long enough that his claim was grandfathered without contest. Elias Brandt had died in 1879. His wife, a woman named Miriam Ruth Brandt, had died in 1882. They had 4 children, 3 of whom left the valley before 1887, when the Grantham family purchased the improved land. In Walter Briggs's index, a single line, Brandt Elias, credited locally as first permanent settler in Upper Clearbone Creek drainage. His cabin, constructed at c. 1861-1863, Juan is the valley's Weiner Geethering, 1864-65. Location now uncertain. Patricia? Vera said, and her voice came out strange. Patricia had already read it. She was quiet for a moment, and then location now uncertain. She looked up. Until now. They looked at each other across the table in the basement records room, and something passed between them, not quite excitement, because Vera was still too cautious for that, had been burned too recently by optimism. But recognition. The recognition of something that mattered. "They're my cemetery," Patricia said, her voice careful. Homesteaders buried their dead on the property. That was common. Vera hadn't thought of that. She thought of it now, and it settled something in her chest, something heavier than excitement. "I need to clear that hillside," she said. "I need to see what's up there." "Yes," Patricia said simply. "You do." She was out on the hillside on a Wednesday afternoon in late February, photographing the entrance to a stone foundation she thought might be a root cellar, when she heard a car on the road below slow and stop. She didn't think much of it. She went back to her photographing. It was only that evening, driving home, that she noticed the tire tracks on the dirt pull-off near the parcel gate. Wide tires, a vehicle heavier than a ranch truck. The tracks showed it had idled for a while, based on the depth of the impression in the soft ground, and then pulled back out. She stopped and looked at them in her headlights for a long time. Then she drove home, and she did not sleep particularly well. The letter came on a Friday in the first week of March. It was on good paper, cream-colored heavy stock, with a logo at the top she didn't immediately recognize. Meridian Resource Group, LLC, Denver, Colorado. The letter was brief, 3 paragraphs, very politely worded in the way that expensive lawyers write letters when they want something, and haven't yet decided how hard to push. The company was engaged in regional resource assessment, and had identified her recently acquired parcel as potentially adjacent to their area of interest. They would be grateful for the opportunity to discuss a possible purchase at her earliest convenience. A number was provided, framed carefully not as an offer but as a starting point for conversation. $40,000 for 55 acres of poison ivy that she had bought for 111. She set the letter down on Dean's table and looked at it for a long time. $40,000 would pay off the loan default and put something back in the account. It would buy her breathing room, maybe 2 years, in which she might be able to rebuild the cattle operation to the point where it supported itself. She thought about that number. She thought about what it would feel like to write that check to Carla Nash at Piedmont Savings and Loan and close that file. Then she thought about the threshold stone, worn smooth in the middle. She folded the letter and put it in the desk drawer. 2 days later, she told June about it, standing outside June's barn while June sorted a pen of kids into weaning groups with the efficient, unhurried competence of someone who had done this 10,000 times, and found in the repetition not boredom but a kind of mastery. "Meridian Resource Group," June said, without looking up. "You know them?" "I know of them." June separated a doe kid from a buck with one smooth movement. "They were sniffing around the Hendricks place 2 years ago, the old grazing lease on the South Ridge. Nothing came of it publicly. But Hendricks told me they were very interested in subsurface rights." Something cold moved through Vera. "Mineral rights. Coal, most likely. There's an old seam that runs through this part of the county, the Clearbone seam, been known about since the 30s. Never developed because the market wasn't there." June looked at her, direct and calm. "That parcel of yours sits on the ridge, upper slope?" "Yeah, I wouldn't sell. I wasn't planning to." "Good." June went back to sorting. "They're going to come back with a bigger number, and when that doesn't work, they'll try something else. That's how these outfits operate." She moved another kid. "Make sure your deed is recorded clean and all the back taxes are cleared." First thing I did. Vera drove home thinking about coal seams and subsurface rights, and a man in a good jacket who had bid to 110 and then let it go too easily, and the more she thought about it, the more certain she became that he had not in fact given up. He had simply changed his method. She found the cemetery in March. She had been working the goats through the upper paddock, the last section, the most impenetrable, where the vine growth was oldest and thickest, when Margaret stopped moving and stood with her head up in the way Vera had learned to read, as the animal detecting something that wasn't right. The herd bunched up behind her. Franklin characteristically ignored the social signal and pushed to the front. Vera walked up to see what they were stopped at. It was a fence, not her fence. An old fence, iron rod and hand-twisted wire, barely standing, mostly consumed by vines that had grown through and over it for decades, but a fence deliberately placed in a rectangle roughly 30 by 40 feet, enclosing a level section of ground where the vine growth inside was oddly sparse, as though even the poison ivy had some respect for what lay beneath. She pushed the gate open, or what had been a gate, the hinges still there, and stepped inside. 7 stones, hand-carved, the lettering worn but legible on most of them. She got down on her knees in the cold ground and read them one by one. Elias Brandt, 1821-1879. He came west and stayed. Miriam Ruth Brandt, 1828-1882. She made it home. 2 smaller stones, both infants, unnamed, dated 1864 and 1869. 3 stones for children old enough to have names, ranging from 2 to 11 years old. All 3 died in the same year, 1878. She sat back on her heels and looked at the 7 stones for a long time. The goats grazed around the fence perimeter, curious and efficient. The wind came down off the ridge and moved through the cedar branches above with a low, continuous sound. 5 children in 1 year. She didn't know what had happened in 1878. She didn't let herself imagine it. What she knew was that Elias Brandt had buried them all up here on this hillside and then kept going, kept farming his terraces and tending his kitchen garden and drawing water from his spring until 1879 when his own stone went up, and then Miriam had kept going for 3 more years after that, alone on this hillside until 1882. She made it home. "I found you," Vera said. It was a strange thing to say to a gravestone, and she knew it. There was nobody around to hear, and it seemed like the right thing to say, and she said it. And then she sat in the cold enclosure with the 7 stones for a little while longer before she took out her notebook and began writing down everything she could see. She called Patricia from the edge of the parcel, standing in the wind with the mountains going dark to the west. "I found the cemetery," she said. The silence on the line had a specific quality. "How many?" 7. Elias and Miriam Brandt, 2 infants, 3 children, all original family. The stones are hand-carved, and most of the lettering is still readable. Another silence. When Patricia spoke again, her voice was careful in the way of someone managing her own response in real time. "Vera, this changes things. A historic burial site on private property triggers preservation considerations. You'd need to contact the County Historical Society, possibly the state office. And if there is a resource company trying to acquire that land, I know," Vera said. "I need to move fast." "Yes," Patricia said, "you do." She drove home in the last of the light with the notebook on the seat beside her, 5 pages of careful documentation of a place that had been hidden for 60 years. The hillside behind her was already disappearing into the dark. Below it in the valley, the lights of Grover Falls were beginning to come on, one by one, across the flat ground. She had gone up that hill looking for a spring. What she had found instead was the place where this valley had started, and the people who had started it, and a story that had been waiting under 60 years of vines for someone to clear the way through and read it. She didn't sleep much that night. There was too much to think about, and thinking had replaced sleeping in the months since Dean died, which was not a sustainable arrangement, but was the one she had. She lay in the dark and thought about Elias Brandt coming west in 1861, 4 years old, walking most of the way from Missouri to somewhere entirely uncertain, because he believed something better was possible. She thought about what it took to keep going after 1878. She thought about Miriam lasting 3 more years alone on that hillside. She made it home. In the morning, Vera got up before the sun, fed the goats and checked the fence and hauled the water tank. And then she drove to Grover Falls to find out what she had and what she could do with it before anyone else got there first. The Grover Falls County Historical Society occupied a Victorian house on the east end of Main Street that smelled permanently of old wood and linseed oil, and the particular mustiness of things that had been kept a long time. Vera had driven past it hundreds of times without ever going in. She went in now. The director was a man named Howard Fisk, 68 years old, wearing a brown cardigan that showed no signs of ever being replaced. He had the quality, rare and genuine, of being excited about history in a way that had never thinned out with age. The way some people's enthusiasms thin out, worn smooth by repetition until they become merely professional. Howard Fisk's enthusiasm was structural. It held him upright. He listened to everything Vera told him, looked at every photograph on her phone, zooming in on the stonework, the chimney, the threshold stone. He read the notes she had photocopied from Walter Briggs's index. Then he sat back in his chair and set his pen down. "The first permanent settler in the upper Clearbone Creek drainage," he said. "Built 1861. He looked at her steadily. "That would make it the oldest surviving structure in that county, possibly in the region. That's what Briggs's index suggests, and there's a complete family cemetery. 7 stones, all legible or partially legible. The 2 infant stones have no names but clear dates. The children's stones have full names." He picked up the pen and set it back down again. "Mrs. Callahan, do you understand what you have up there?" "I'm to." There are people who have been looking for the Brant homestead for 40 years. Scholars, historians, preservation groups. Walter Briggs spent the last decade of his life searching for it. He died without finding it. A pause. And your goats found it. My goats found it, she agreed. He was already reaching for his phone. He made 2 calls in quick succession, the first to the State Historical Preservation Office in Denver, the second to a woman at the State University named Dr. Alice Summers, an architectural historian who specialized in early Colorado settlement. Howard spoke to her for 6 minutes with the focused efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this conversation and was not going to waste it. When he hung up, his expression had settled into something Vera recognized as the particular focus of a person running a problem that finally has enough pieces to run. I want to be direct with you, he said. Once we file a formal documentation request, this site may qualify for state and potentially national historic designation. That gives it legal protection that would be very, very difficult to override. He paused. A resource company with interest in the subsurface rights would find that extremely inconvenient. I've already heard from one. He looked at her without surprise. Meridian, $40,000. That's not an offer. That's a first contact. He leaned forward slightly. May I ask you something directly? She said yes. Why don't you take the money? Clear your problems with the bank, walk away better off than you were before. It was a fair question. It deserved a genuine answer, not the reflexive one. Vera looked at the surface of Howard's desk for a moment, which was covered in stacks of folders organized by a system she couldn't decipher. Because the minute I sell, she said, they strip out whatever they're after. Elias Brant disappears again permanently this time, and 160 years from now, nobody will know where this valley started. Howard Fisk looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he picked up his phone again. Let me call the state office, he said. There are things that need to move before anyone else figures out what's on that hillside. She drove home through the flat, late afternoon light of a march in Colorado, the kind of light that stretches everything out and makes the distances look greater than they are. The mountains to the west had gone that deep blue they turned in the last hour before dusk. She thought about Elias Brant coming to this valley in 1861, when the mountains had looked the same color at this hour, exactly the same, the light unchanging, across 140 years of everything else changing around it. The second letter from Meridian arrived 11 days later, delivered by certified mail, which required further signature, which meant they knew she had received it. $280,000. She sat at Dean's table with the letter in front of her and did not move for a long time. Outside, the late March wind pushed against the windows in a way that made the house feel smaller than it was. $280,000 was not breathing room. It was a different life. The cattle operation rebuilt, the equipment replaced. The mortgage paid with money left over, the first time money would be left over since before Dean's diagnosis. It was the feeling of ground under her knee after a long time of feeling like she was standing on something that might give way. She thought about that for the full amount of time it deserved. Then she called June. It was 11 o'clock at night. The phone rang twice. Vera. June's voice was the voice of someone who had been awake, not just woken up. They came back, Vera said. 280, a silence that had a specific weight to it. Then put the kettle on, I'll drive over. June arrived 40 minutes later and sat at Dean's table, accepted a mug of tea without ceremony, and they sat across from the kitchen with the table between them and the night outside the windows, and June did not tell Vera what to do. She didn't perform concern or manufacture perspective. She just sat there, which was the thing Vera needed most, and had least access to in the 14 months since Dean died, another person in the room who understood that some things had to be waded through. Eventually, Vera said, the man in the good jacket at the auction knew about the coal before I bought the parcel. He bid to 110 to test whether anyone else knew what was under that hillside. I didn't know. I bid 111 because I needed the spring and the lands one was cheap, and I had a feeling I couldn't explain. He looked at me and decided I wasn't a threat. June's hands were around her mug. And now he knows I'm a problem. She looked at the letter on the table. Going from 40,000 to 280 isn't how you negotiate. That's how you run out of time. June nodded. Once, the nod of someone who had already thought through the same thing and arrived at the same place. What does Howard say? He's pushing the state to move faster on the documentation. Dr. Summers is coming out in 2 weeks. She paused. 2 weeks is a long time. It is, June agreed. Sleep tonight anyway. The hill's not going anywhere. Vera slept, though not well. She was up before 5, doing the morning chores in the dark, and she was checking the water tank on the lower paddock when she heard tires on the county road below, 2 vehicles moving slowly. She straightened and looked. 2 trucks pulled off onto the BLM access strip that ran between her parcel boundary and the road, a drab 40-foot wide corridor of federal land that had always seemed like a bureaucratic formality, the kind of boundary that existed on maps more than in the physical world. A third vehicle, smaller, followed them in. She walked to the south fence line. By the time she got there, the trucks were parked and 3 men she had never seen were getting out. One carried survey equipment. Another had a GPS unit already running, where they moved with the comfortable efficiency of people who had been hired to do a specific thing and were doing it. The side of the nearest truck read High Point Survey and Assessment, Pueblo. She stood at her fence line and looked at them. One of them looked back and offered a pleasant nod. "Morning, what are you doing?" "Survey work." "Easy, unbothered. Nothing that concerns your property, ma'am." She photographed the truck, the equipment, the GPS unit, and the 3 men, then called Howard from where she stood with the wind in her face. "They're surveying the BLM strip," she said, "from the county road to the corner of my south boundary." Howard was quiet for a moment in a way that meant he was thinking quickly. If they establish a legal access route across that strip and apply for a forced access easement, they could run equipment to the edge of your parcel without your permission. The legal standard for forced access on historically significant land is high, but it's a motion they could make. A pause. It's also a pressure move. They want you to know they're still working the problem. She watched the surveyors. The one with the clipboard was writing something down with the comfortable focus of a person doing routine work, not someone who thought he was doing anything wrong, because he wasn't. He was a surveyor. He had been hired to survey. The wrongness was somewhere above his pay grade, sitting in an office in Denver with a view of the mountains and a folder of geological assessments marked proprietary. "I need Dr. Summers' report filed," she said. "I'm calling her today. Call her every day." A short pause. "All right," Howard said. "Every day." Dr. Alice Summers arrived on a Thursday in early April. Driving a mud-spattered university sedan, she parked at an angle that suggested parallel lines had stopped interesting her so sometime in graduate school. She was 51, compact and brisk, with short gray hair and the focused, slightly forward-leaning energy of someone whose mind was consistently running a few steps ahead of whatever she was physically doing. She shook Vera's hand, looked up at the hillside where the goats were visible on the upper slope, Franklin leading some private expedition as usual, and said, "Tell me everything. Start from when you bought it." Vera told her everything. They walked the parcel while she talked. Dr. Summers stopping constantly to crouch down and look at things, to take her own photographs, to measure wall sections with a tape pulled from her jacket pocket, to mutter numbers into a small recorder she kept in her breast pocket. She looked at the terracing for a long time without speaking, running her hand along the stone edges, pressing her thumb into the mortar-free joints. "Dry-laid construction," she said mostly to herself. "Pre-industrial. The fitting technique is consistent with the 1860s. She stood and looked across the slope at the full extent of the visible terracing. He knew what he was doing. This isn't amateur work. At the cemetery, she went very still. She stood inside the fence for a long time without touching anything, reading each stone in sequence. When she reached the 3 children's stones, all dated 1878, she stayed with them longer than the others. The wind moved through the cedar branches above, the same low sound it always made up here, indifferent to years. "Ilia's branch," she said at last, not loudly. 1821 to 1879. She turned to look at Vera. "You know he kept a journal." Vera went perfectly still. "A journal. It passed through several hands after the family dispersed. It's in a private collection. Now, a collector, I know." Doctor. Summers crouched and looked at the lettering on Elias's stone. "I've been working with a transcription of it for 6 years. He documented this valley in extraordinary detail. The land, the climate, the neighbors, the first community gatherings." She paused. "Scholars have been using it as a primary source for 40 years without knowing where he actually lived." The hillside seemed to tilt slightly under Vera's feet. "The journal describes this place." Dr. Summers stood, brushing dirt from her knees. "In detail specific enough that someone standing on this hillside with the journal could locate the cabin, the terrace ring, the spring." She looked at Vera with a direct assessment of someone deciding how clearly to say what she was thinking. "This is not just a historic site, Mrs. Callahan. This is a site that is already documented in existing primary source material. The evidentiary case for designation is extraordinarily strong. How long does National Register designation take? Normally months, sometimes longer." A pause. "But I know the people who matter, and when I call them about this, they will understand why it needs to move faster than normal. I can have a full assessment report ready in 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Vera said. 3 weeks. Dr. Summers was already reaching for her recorder, already narrating. "And I'm going to contact the National Register office directly, not just the state." Vera looked at Elias Brandt's stone. He came west and stayed. She thought about what it meant to stay somewhere, what it cost, what it built across the years that staying produced. "Do whatever you need to do," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." Dr. Summers nodded once, businesslike, her recorder already running. "Neither is this hill." That evening, alone in the kitchen with the assessments notes spread across Dean's table, Vera took out her notebook and opened to a blank page. She had been working on what she might say if it came to a public meeting, shaping it into something useful. Every draft came out wrong, too formal or too argumentative, or too much like a document and not enough like the truth. Then she took out the transcriptions of Elias Brenton's journal, which Dr. Summers had arranged to have sent to her, and she sat with it. He had not been a natural writer. He had taught himself to read and write as an adult, and the evidence of that effort was in every line, the careful hand of someone who had never quite lost his reverence for the act of putting words down. He wrote about the first winter, the cold he had not been prepared for even after being told to prepare. The specific sound the wind made in the cedar trees on the ridge above the cabin. A neighbor who came through in February and shared 2 meals and kept going west. The morning the chimney was finished and the first fire lit inside it, and how Miriam had stood in the open doorway watching the smoke rise and said it looked like the hill was breathing. "The hill is breathing," Elias had written. "This is ours now." Vera set the transcription down. She sat at Dean's table in the quiet house and felt something crack open in her chest, quietly, without drama. Not grief exactly, more like recognition. The sensation of someone else's words fitting exactly the shape of a feeling you had been carrying without a name for it. Dean had said something like that, not those words, but close enough. Their first winter here, after they fixed the roof section that had been leaking and sat inside listening to the snow. And Dean had looked around the kitchen and said it felt like theirs now, like they had earned it by working on it. She had not let herself think about Dean much in the past few months. There had not been space for it. She thought about him now, sitting with the journal transcription, and the grief came in the particular way it came sometimes, not sharp but wide, an awareness of the whole dimension of what was gone. She sat with it for a while. Then she opened her notebook and started writing differently, not preparing remarks, but writing about why this place mattered. The only honest thing she knew how to do with words. The third letter from Meridian did not come by mail. It came in person on a Tuesday morning in early April, while Vera was in the barn working through the herd's hooves, a job she disliked intensely and the goats disliked more. A twice-yearly negotiation between her determination and their profound objection to having their feet handled. She heard a vehicle come up the drive and knew immediately it wasn't a ranch truck. The engine sound was too smooth, too self-contained. She set down the hoof pick, wiped her hands, and walked out. Black SUV. The kind of clean that meant someone else was responsible for maintaining it. The man who stepped out was the man from the auction. She had his name now from the letters he had signed. Gavin Prentice, Vice President of Land Acquisition, Meridian Resource Group. He was perhaps 52, silver at the temples, with a face that had been handsome when younger, and had settled into something more calculated. He wore a different jacket from the one at the auction, but the same quality. He looked at the barn, at the goats visible on the hillside, at Vera's dirty jeans and the hoof pick she was still carrying, and he arranged his expression into something warm. "Mrs. Callahan, I hope I'm not interrupting." She looked at him the way she looked at a fence gate that someone had touched without permission, checking for damage before deciding how to respond. "You could have called. I prefer to speak in person when possible." She thought about saying no. She thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved, and then, "Come in."
She didn't offer coffee.
She sat across from him at Dean's table, with her hands flat on the wood, and waited. He opened with appreciation. He was good at it, specific and warm, calling out the clearing work, the goat operation, using numbers he had clearly researched beforehand. He called it remarkable. He called it entrepreneurial. She watched him deciding in real time which version of her he was dealing with, cataloging what he saw, adjusting his approach. She let him finish. "I'll be direct," he said. "Our previous offer stands, but given the preservation activity that's been initiated, and we're aware of Dr. Summers' involvement, we'd like to resolve this quickly while resolution is still simple." A pause calibrated to seem genuine. "We're prepared to go to $400,000, Mrs. Callahan. Final offer." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the goats. "That's a lot of money," she said. "It is. What's under my hill, Mr. Prentice?" Something moved across his face, quick as a shadow on water, there and gone. "I'm sorry. The coal seam, the clear bone seam. How much of it runs under my parcel and what is it worth?" The warmth in his expression recalibrated, settling into something more careful. "Our geological assessments are proprietary." "Of course they are." She kept her hands flat on the table. "So you won't tell me. What you can tell me is that your offer is substantially above market value for unimproved acreage in this." "My acreage isn't unimproved anymore," she said, "and it isn't unimportant anymore. I think you know both of those things. That's why you drove out here yourself, instead of sending another letter." He looked at her. The calculation was visible now, not hostile, just present. The look of someone doing genuine arithmetic about a situation that had not resolved the way it was supposed to. So Vera, his use of her first name was deliberate, a small recalibration toward informality. "These processes can stall. They can be challenged." Said neutrally, as information being shared between people navigating a situation together. Property owners who cooperate with resource development often find the process mutually beneficial. There are community benefit agreements, employment considerations, Mr. Prentice. She said his name flat, not rudely, just to stop the forward motion of the pitch. Elias Brandt built that cabin in 1861. His wife made this valley into a community, organized the first winter gatherings, kept the records of who was there. 5 of their children are buried up on that hillside. He built terraces with his hands so the soil wouldn't wash away, because he understood that if you didn't hold on to the land, you lost everything built on top of it. She paused. I'm not selling the hill he's buried in so you can dig coal out from under him. That's where we are. The silence stretched out between them. Gavin Prentice picked up his jacket from the back of the chair where he had laid when he sat, an act that now struck her as presumptuous in the specific way that people who assume they'll be welcome tend to presume. He stood. I understand, he said, in a tone that suggested he was choosing not to argue about it today, not that he was done. She walked him to the car, watched the black SUV turn around at the end of the drive and move back toward the county road, smooth and quiet as something engineered to be exactly that. Then she went back to the barn and finished the hooves. She called Howard that evening. He came to the house. In person, $400,000. He called it a final offer. It isn't. Knows that. She was standing at the kitchen window looking out at the dark. He said the preservation process could be challenged, that it could stall. He's not wrong that it can be challenged, but a formal challenge to a National Register nomination is expensive, public, and tends to generate exactly the kind of attention that resource extraction companies prefer to avoid. A pause. That said, Dr. Summers's report isn't complete yet. Until it's filed, we're in a window where they have options. How much longer? She told me 10 days. Call her every day, Howard. I've been calling her every other day. Every day, Vera said. A pause. Every day, he agreed. She hung up and stood at the window and thought about the way Prentice had said, these processes can stall in the same neutral register you'd use to comment on weather. She had been married to a rancher for 19 years. She understood what it meant when something that looked calm was working very hard underneath. She wasn't wrong about the working. It came from an unexpected direction. Roy Stanton called on a Friday evening, the first time he had called since Dean's funeral, when he had left a message saying he was sorry for her loss and that if she needed anything, she shouldn't hesitate. The kind of offer people make when they are fairly certain it won't be taken up. His voice had a quality she didn't recognize right away. It took her a moment to place it. Discomfort. Roy Stanton was uncomfortable, which was notable because Roy was a man who had not appeared uncomfortable in her presence in 30 years of living a mile and a half apart. There had been a meeting at the Elks Lodge in Grover Falls the previous evening. Someone from a Denver company, Resource Development Minerals. Someone from that company had talked to 15 or 20 ranchers and told them the preservation work on Vera's parcel was going to lock up the Clearbone seam for the whole county. Said there was coal under half the valley, and that once her parcel got designated, the whole seam became politically untouchable. County would lose out on royalty revenue. Just who? There she asked. People. A pause. A lot of people. Another pause. Longer. Including me. She waited. Some of them were worked up about it. The younger guys especially. They're worried about ranch economics, and the coal money sounds good on paper. A silence. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Because it's the right thing to do, she said. After she hung up, she sat completely still at Dean's table and let herself feel, for 2 minutes exactly, the full weight of it, the loneliness of it, the specific exhaustion of being one person standing in front of something large that kept finding new angles to come at her from. She had learned in the months since Dean died that she could give herself 2 minutes, and then she had to stop, because there was always something that needed doing, and self-pity was the most expensive luxury she couldn't afford. 2 minutes. Then she called Howard. He's going to the community, she said, and explained what Roy had told her. Howard listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. That's smart, he said. Cynical and wrong, but smart. If he generates enough community opposition, it complicates the political picture even if the legal case is solid. A pause. He can't stop the designation. The National Register process isn't a popularity contest, but he can make noise and he can put you in the position of being the person who cost this county coal jobs. Howard's voice shifted slightly. How do you feel about speaking publicly? She almost laughed. I hate it. I know. But there's a county commission meeting in 3 weeks, regular session, public comment period. If we present the historical significance of this site, not just the legal picture, but the actual story, what this place means for the valley's own history, I believe people respond to that differently than they respond to a mineral rights argument. She thought about standing up in the county commission chambers with Roy Stanton in the room and Travis Stanton looking amused and Gavin Prentice somewhere in the background watching to see what she did. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks. Set it up, she said. She spent the following 2 weeks preparing in a way she had never prepared for anything before, which was to say badly, then less badly, then almost competently. She was not a public speaker. She had never pretended to be. Dean had been the one who could hold a room, easy and specific and unhurried, with the quiet authority of a man who knew what I was talking about and didn't feel the need to prove it. She wrote out what she wanted to say, and it sounded like a report. She rewrote it, and it sounded like an argument. She rewrote it a third time and realized the problem was that she was trying to win something instead of say something true. She sat at Dean's table on a Wednesday night 3 days before the meeting and read the Eliab Brandt Journal transcription again. All of it, from the first entry in 1861 to the last in 1878, the year everything changed. He wrote in the measured cadences of a man who took writing seriously because he had worked hard to be able to do it. He wrote about the cold and the work and the neighbors and the crops. He wrote about Miriam. He wrote about the children by name, each one, in the way you write about people you are watching grow, with the specific attention of someone who understands that attention is its own form of love. After 1878, there were only a few more entries. They were shorter. They contained no ornament. She closed the transcription. She opened her notebook. She wrote for 40 minutes without stopping, not a speech, just what was true. And when she read it back, she thought it might be close enough to something she could stand up and say. The county commission chambers held 80 people comfortably and had closer to 120 when the session opened, the overflow standing along the back wall. Vera had hoped for a decent turnout and was not prepared for the room to be full. She recognized nearly every face, people who had been at her wedding, at Dean's funeral, at the auction where they had laughed. They were not laughing now. They looked serious in the way people look when money is involved and they're not sure which side of an argument serves their interest. Gavin Prentice was there, third row, with a younger man beside him carrying a laptop. He caught her eye across the room and nodded, a small neutral acknowledgement, professional to professional. She nodded back. When the younger man beside Prentice looked down at his laptop and Prentice settled back in his chair, something in his posture shifted slightly. He was watching her directly, not aggressively, but watching. The particular stillness of someone who had decided that observation was more useful than action at this particular moment. It lasted 8 or 9 seconds until the commission chair said her name and she stood up. The room went quiet. Howard had presented the historical case first, precise and unflinching, 20 minutes of specific evidence delivered without notes. He was followed by a man representing something called the Grover Falls County Landowners Coalition, a group Vera had never heard of that appeared to have organized itself in the past 3 weeks. He made the coal argument, jobs and royalty revenue, and the economic stagnation of a county that had been watching its young people leave for a generation. He was persuasive in the way economic arguments are always persuasive when people are genuinely worried about money, and Vera watched the room shift while he spoke, bodies leaning forward, arms crossing in different configurations. Then it was her turn. She stood up and looked at the room, at the faces she had known most of her life, and for a moment her mind went completely blank. Not stage fright exactly, more in the instant suspension before it gives way under pressure, that split second of pure stillness before motion becomes inevitable. Elias Brandt got here in 1861, she said. He was 40 years old. He had walked most of the way from Missouri, which I've been thinking about a lot lately, because that is an extraordinary thing to do at 40. To walk away from everything you know and go somewhere completely uncertain, because you believe something better is possible. The room was very quiet. He built a cabin on that hillside by hand. He cut terraces into the slope to hold the soil because he understood that if you don't hold what you've built onto, it washes away and you lose everything. He raised a family up there. He buried 5 of his children in 1 year. She paused, and he stayed. She could feel the room listening, not agreeing necessarily, just listening, which was the most she had hoped for. He wrote it all down. His journal is in Denver right now, and scholars have been using it for 40 years to understand what this valley looked like and how the first people lived here. But nobody knew where he was. We didn't know where our own history was. She looked at Roy Stanton. He was looking at the floor. I bought that hillside for $111 because I needed the spring. I'm going to be honest with you. I did not buy it to find a historic site. I did not buy it to prevent coal development. I bought it because I was running out of options, and I had a feeling about it that I couldn't entirely explain. She stopped for a moment. What I found up there changed from what I understand about this valley and about what we owe the people who were here before us. She looked at the room. Mine coal from somewhere else you cannot find. You cannot another Elias Brandt. You cannot rebuild what you erase. She sat down. The room held its breath for a moment. Then the sound that came was not applause, but something closer to a collective exhale. The sound of a room releasing what it had been holding and returning to itself. People turning to speak quietly to the person beside them, which was its own kind of response. Howard, across the room, looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read but recognized as something carefully managed. The expression of a man who knew better than to call something done before it was done, but who was permitting himself a private moment of thinking it might be. She glanced at Gavin Prentice. He was looking at his phone. The commission voted 4-1 to submit a letter of support to the State Historical Preservation Office for the branch site designation. Vera drove home, fed the goats, stood in the barn for a while in the lantern light before going inside. It was a vote. It was a letter. It was not a designation, not yet. And Gavin Prentice was still in the valley, and there were still weeks before the National Register decision, and she still owed Piedmont Savings and Loan for $1,847. And Carla Nash had extended her twice and would not extend a third time. She had not solved anything. She had just not lost yet. She went inside and made herself a bowl of soup and sat at Dean's table in the quiet house. The kind of tired she felt was not the kind solved by sleep. It went all the way down to the structure of things. She sat with it the way you sit with things that can't be fixed quickly. Then she washed the bowl and went to bed. The foreclosure filing date arrived on a Monday in mid-May. Carla Nash had been as good as her word. 2 extensions and not a third. 6 weeks out. Vera read the document standing at the mailbox in the morning light, and her hands did not shake. She had been expecting it long enough that its actual arrival produced something closer to exhaustion than fear. She folded it, put it in her jacket pocket, and did the morning chores. She drove to the bank, not because she expected mercy, but because she wanted to look Carla Nash in the face and say what needed saying before the process moved forward. Carla was in her office and looked up when Vera appeared in the doorway with the expression of a woman who had been doing a difficult job long enough to have made peace with the parts that required her to be unmoved. Vera sat down across the desk. I need 60 days. 60 days twice. I know that. She put her hands on the desk, not her own wood, someone else's desk, and looked at Carla directly. The preservation designation on my parcel is moving through the state process. Once it's designated, I have access to preservation grants, research partnership agreements, educational access fees. Howard Fisk has had preliminary conversations with 2 university programs about research access. She paused. I need 60 days for the process to catch up with what I actually have. Carla looked at the file. She looked at Vera. She had the look of someone doing genuine internal arithmetic, the kind that involves more than numbers. I'll take it to the board Thursday, she said at last. I'm not promising. I know, Vera said. Thank you. She drove home and didn't let herself think about Thursday until Thursday came. There was a fence that needed mending on the south pasture, and the goats needed their second rotation moved, and there were 40 other things that needed doing today, none of which would wait. The drought announced itself slowly, the way droughts do, through accumulating absence rather than dramatic arrival. April had been dry. May was drier. Clearbone Creek was already running low by the 3rd week of May, a full month before it usually began to drop. She noticed it first in how the cattle moved, the restless ground-covering movement of animals looking for water that was getting scarce. At the feed store in Grover Falls, conversations that used to run to cattle prices and equipment trouble had shifted entirely to creek levels and almanac predictions nobody fully trusted. Her own pasture grass was coming in thin, not disastrous yet, but thin in the way experienced ranchers recognize as the first signal of a problem that will get worse before it gets better. What she had, which she hadn't fully reckoned with until she walked the cleared hillside on a morning in late May and really looked at it, was the parcel. The reclaimed soil was producing grass with a vigor she had not anticipated, not the tentative growth she had seen pushing up in the early spring, but real grass deep-rooted and dense, the kind you get from land that has been accumulating fertility for decades without anyone asking anything of it. The terraces Elias Brandt had cut into the slope were doing exactly what they had been built to do, holding each rainfall in place, letting it soak down into the soil instead of running off the slope. The spring in the upper section was running full and clear, while Clearbone Creek dropped below its bank. She stood on the hillside and looked at the grass and thought, this is going to matter. She just didn't know yet exactly how. The bank board gave her 45 days. Howard called with the news from the State Preservation Office the same afternoon. For a moment, she sat in her truck in the driveway with a phone in each hand, figuratively, and thought about the particular absurdity of good news and bad news arriving at the same hour, which was something that happened often enough in life that she had stopped being surprised by it. The state review had come back positive. The State Board of Review had recommended the Brandt Homestead for National Register nomination. The file was now at the federal level. The final decision would come from the keeper of the National Register. Timeline, 60 to 90 days. She had 45 from the bank. There's a gap, she told Howard. There are bridge options. Emergency preservation loans through the State Historical Fund. Designed for exactly this kind of situation. Designation pending. Landowner needs short-term support. Do it. I already started the application, he said. She sat in the truck for another minute after hanging up. The mountains to the west were the color they turned in late afternoon. that deep blue purple that looked painted against the white of the sky above them. She had looked at those mountains every day of her life and still found them, on certain evenings, almost unbearable in their indifference to everything happening below them. 45 days. She would work with 45 days. The first rancher to call about feed was Pete Morrison, 300 head on the bench south of Grover Falls, a quiet operation that didn't make news because nothing went wrong. He called on a Tuesday in early June. His grass was running out 2 weeks earlier than his calculations. His supplemental feed supplier in Pueblo had a 6-week backlog. He had heard somewhere that she had grass on the hillside parcel. She was honest with him. The terrain wasn't right for outside cattle, and she couldn't have outside livestock on the site during the preservation documentation period. But they talked about cut and deliver options. She said she would call him back. Then she called June. "I need to walk the hillside with someone who knows what they're looking at," she said. "I need to understand what I actually have up there and what I can and can't do with it without compromising the preservation work." 6:30 tomorrow morning, June said. They walked for 2 hours. June moved across the hillside with the reading attention of someone who had been looking at land for 40 years, touching soil, pulling grass to check root depth, following the terrace edges to see where the water pooled and soaked. She checked the spring output with the kind of practical focus that needs no known instruments because the knowledge is already in her hands. "You've got something here," June said at last, standing at the upper terrace with the spring audible somewhere in the willows to their left. "This soil is." She paused, which was unusual for June, who did not pause when she was describing things she understood. "You don't find this often. The vine mulch has been building carbon in this ground for 60 years. You're sitting on topsoil that most farmers would kill for. What can I do with it that doesn't disturb the historic site?" June thought about it seriously. Hay production doesn't require heavy equipment if you're selective. Hand-cut the terrace sections, small square bales, sell direct to small operations. Labor-intensive but possible. She looked across the hillside. Or you keep the goats rotating through and sell the milk product rather than the forage. You keep control of what happens on the site, and you monetize the productivity differently. "I've been thinking about cheese," Vera said. June looked at her. "How long have you been thinking about cheese?" "Since February." June was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with a precision that Vera had come to understand was June's version of warmth, "Sell hay to the people who need it at fair prices. Not charity, not gouging, fair. You're going to need goodwill in this valley more than you need to maximize short-term revenue." "I know. And start the cheese operation small. Get your process."
Scale.
She looked at Vera for a moment. "When I sold you those first animals, I thought there was a reasonable chance you'd lose them all by spring. I lost one." "One," June said. "Yeah." She looked at the hillside. "You move carefully. People mistake that for moving slowly. They're not the same thing." Vera drove home with the windows down despite the early June heat, the dry air moving through the truck. And she thought about Dean, who had moved fast at everything. Quick decisions and quick commitments, confidence in his own instincts that she had spent 20 years both admiring and occasionally being alarmed by. She was not Dean. She had never been Dean. She moved through things differently, more slowly, more sideways sometimes, circling back. It had cost her things over the years, that difference. She was beginning to think it might also be what had kept her here. By the end of June, the drought was not a concern people mentioned in passing. It was the primary fact of life in Sagebrush Flats Valley. Clearbone Creek had dropped to a thin trickle. The bench pastures had gone brown 3 weeks earlier than anyone could remember. 2 operations east of Grover Falls had already begun hauling cattle to sale rather than watch them lose condition, taking whatever the market offered for animals they weren't ready to sell. Roy Stanton showed up at Vera's gate on a Thursday morning without calling ahead. He stood beside his truck with his hat in his hand. Roy Stanton, who ran 600 head and had done for 30 years, who had never in her memory stood with his hat in his hand for anyone. "I need to buy hay," he said, "or access to hay, or whatever you've got up there that you're willing to sell." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the courthouse. She thought about, "Honey, you just bought yourself a pile of itch." She thought about every version of this conversation in which she said what she was entitled to say, which was no or not yet, or let's talk about what you said and how you said it first. She thought about that for exactly as long as it deserved. "Come inside," she said. "I'll put coffee on." He sat at Dean's table. She put coffee in front of him and sat across, and they talked practically about what she had and what he needed. She had approximately 40 tons of standing hay, equivalent on the upper terraces by her own estimate, confirmed by June's assessment. She could supply cut and baled product at 10 tons at a time, using the small square baler she had borrowed from Patricia's nephew. She quoted him a price that was fair, current market rate adjusted for regional drought conditions, not above it. He looked at the number and nodded. "That's fair." "It is," she said. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "Vera," he stopped, started again. "What I said at the auction. A pause long enough to have things in it. I was wrong, not just about the land. She looked at him across the table. About what you could do, he said, on your own. He said it the way people say things they have not said before and are saying now because they have run out of reasons not to. I was wrong about that. She was not going to make it easy. She was also not going to make it hard. First delivery starts next week, she said, 10 tons by Friday. He finished his coffee and stood at the door and turned back. Dean would have liked how that went. He left. Vera stood at the kitchen window and watched his truck go down the drive. Dean would have liked how that went, she thought. Dean had always believed that people were capable of surprising you if you gave them the room to do it. Today, he'd been right. The calls came in through the last week of June and into July, steady as the drought that had stopped pretending to be temporary. Pete Morrison confirmed the cut and deliver arrangement 2 days after Roy's first delivery arrived. A woman named Lena Briggs, who ran a horse operation on the North Bench, called Thursday morning, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who had already spent a week trying every other option. A dairy farmer 12 miles out needed bedding straw as much as forage, and a fourth rancher, a man named Cal Witten, who barely spoke at the best of times, drove out in person and stood in Vera's yard and said 4 words, "You got anything left?" She said yes to all of them at the same price. She hired the Garrett brothers through June Whitmore, 2 men in their 30s, who arrived the first Monday of July with their own equipment and worked from sunup without complaint. The terrain on the upper terraces was uneven and the footing uncertain, but they moved through it with a methodical efficiency that Vera respected, cutting in the cool of the early morning, stacking in the afternoon, loading and delivering before the day's heat peaked. She paid them fairly. They didn't ask for more than that. The first hay payment cleared on a Friday, $1,100 deposited into her operating account at Piedmont Savings, not toward the loan, just into the account. She watched the teller process it and thought about what it meant to watch a number move in the right direction after so long of watching it move the other way. The emergency preservation loan from the State Historical Fund came through in the 3rd week of July. $12,000. Short-term, low interest, secured against the pending designation. It covered the bank default, with enough left over that she held a small balance for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember. She moved the surplus immediately into the operating account and made a list of what came next. The cheese operation started on a Saturday morning in late July. She had spent 4 consecutive weekends in June and July driving to Pueblo, taking informal instruction from a woman named Ruth Ann, whose husband had run a small dairy farm for 30 years, before his knees gave out and he sold the herd. Ruth Ann had been making cheese in the farmhouse kitchen for 3 decades and taught the way people teach when they have genuinely mastered something and have no patience for shortcuts. She would watch Vera's hands and say nothing until the moment when saying nothing would cost more than speaking, and then she would say exactly one thing, which was always the right thing. Vera paid attention in the way she paid attention to things she knew she was only going to get one real chance to learn. The first batch in the barn kitchen at home was wrong. She knew before she even cut into it, something off in the texture, a graininess that shouldn't have been there. And when the rind developed unevenly 3 days later, she threw out 8 pounds of what should have been a soft chèvre and wrote down everything she had done differently from what Ruth Ann had shown her. The second batch was better. The third was right. She called Ruth Ann from the barn with a photograph, describing what she was seeing. A pause on the line while Ruth Ann looked at the image. Not bad. The rind's a little thin on the south side. Watch your humidity. That was all. Vera adjusted the conditions in the aging space she had built into the back corner of the barn and watched her humidity. By August, she was producing 20 pounds a week that she would sell. The owner of a farm-to-table restaurant in Grover Falls had heard about it through a supply chain that included the dairy farmer who bought her bedding straw. He tasted it and said he would take everything she could make at a price nearly 4 times what a distributor in Pueblo would have paid for the raw milk. She told June about it over the phone that evening. 4 times, June said. 4 times. A pause on June's end that carried the quality of someone recalculating. How's the scale going to work? Slowly, Vera said. I know what you're going to say. Slow is right for cheese, June said. Slow is right for most things worth doing. The hay sales had brought in roughly $8,000 by the end of July. Combined with the preservation loan, it was the first real financial stability she had felt in nearly 2 years. Not surplus, not security, but the feeling of solid ground underfoot. The difference between wondering whether the floor would hold and simply walking across it. Howard's call came on a Wednesday morning in the 2nd week of August, while she was in the barn checking the cheese cultures she had set the night before. She almost let it go to voicemail. She saw his name on the screen and put everything down. It's moving faster than we expected. No preamble. Howard had never mastered preamble when he had something to say. The federal reviewer contacted me this morning. She's asking for 1 supplemental document, a chain of title record confirming continuous absence of commercial development since the original Homestead period. It's a problem. It's a formality. She wouldn't be asking for it if she were going to deny. A pause in which she could hear the weight of what he was managing not to say before he said it. Patricia is already pulling the records. She called me before I called you. We're looking at 10 days, maybe fewer, if Patricia works at her usual pace. And then the keeper signs it and it's in. National Register of Historic Places. Permanent federal designation. He said the words carefully. The way you say words you have been waiting to say for a long time. Nobody touches that hillside. Not Meridian. Not anyone. Not without a federal preservation review that would cost more in legal exposure than the coal is worth to extract. She leaned against the barn wall. Outside, the morning was already warm, the dry August heat that settled into the valley floor by 8 and stayed until well after dark. Howard, she said. Yeah, thank you. She said it plainly, without anything built around it. He had spent 4 months calling people every day and filing documents and driving to meetings and believing in the importance of a dead man's cabin on a hillside when the obvious financial logic said it wasn't worth the effort. She wanted him to know she understood that, even if she had no particular way to say it that matched its weight. He was quiet for a moment. Don't thank me yet, he said. 10 days, she said. She hung up stood into the barn and felt something very large that had been pressing on her chest for a very long time, beginning not to lift, not quite, not yet, but to shift the way weight shifts when something underneath it starts to change position. Gavin Prentice called that same afternoon. She didn't know how he knew. A federal reviewer asking for supplementary documentation was a public filing, the signal, visible to anyone tracking the case, readable by people with the resources and the motivation to read them fast. He had both, Mrs. Callahan. The voice measured, warm, calibrated. I was hoping we might speak before things become final. They're not final yet. No. But they're moving in a direction that limits everyone's options. A pause. I'd like to make one more proposal in person if you're willing. There may be a structure here that works for both of us, something that addresses your financial situation and still allows Meridian to pursue the resource assessment on the lower portion of the parcel below the historic site boundary. She almost said no immediately. She thought instead, which was not the same thing. The lower portion of the parcel below the cabin, below the terraces, below the cemetery was a section she had cleared, but that the formal documentation was not centered on. The upper 2/3 of the parcel held everything historically significant. The lower 18 or so acres were cleared land, productive now, but not part of the original homestead footprint in any documented way. She needed to know what he actually knew. She needed to hear him say it. Tomorrow, she said. Here, 10 o'clock. He arrived exact 10, which she noted. Alone this time, no associate with a laptop. He came to the door rather than waiting beside his vehicle, which was different from the last visit in a way she logged without comment. She put coffee on without asking. They sat at Dean's table. He opened a folder and laid out a map, a topographic overlay of her parcel, with the historic site boundary drawn in red and the lower section shaded separately. The work of someone who had been building toward this meeting for a while. The proposal was this. Meridian would purchase the surface and mineral rights to the lower 18 acres, everything below the red line. The historic site boundary would remain entirely intact, with all extraction activity confined to the southern edge, well outside the designation area. Vera would retain ownership of the upper 37 acres, including the cabin, the terracing, the kitchen garden foundation, the root cellar, the cemetery. Meridian would fund a permanent conservation easement protecting the historic site in perpetuity, and they would pay $450,000 for the lower section. She looked at the map. She looked at the red line, which was drawn generously, the buffer between the protected area and the proposed extraction boundary wider than it needed to be. When did you know about the coal? She said. He looked at her directly, which, she had come to understand, was a thing he did when he thought directness would serve him better than deflection. The geological assessment was completed before the auction. There it was, the cold confirmation of what she had known since the evening she sat in her truck at the stock pond with the deed on the passenger seat. You bid to 110 to see if anyone else knew. We were testing market awareness. The access geometry was uncertain at the time, contingent on establishing a southern entry route. At 110, the risk calculus didn't support going further. He paused. We underestimated the parcel's other potential complications. You didn't think anyone would find the cabin, correct? She gave him credit for that. He said it without ornament, the same way he would have confirmed a delivery date or an acreage figure. So you let me buy it for $111, she said, knowing there was significant coal underneath it. Planning to come back with a purchase offer you expected I'd accept because I needed the money. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. She put the map down and looked at Dean's table, the ponderosa pine he had sanded smooth across 19 winters, the wood that carried every meal they had eaten, every conversation they had had, and every difficult morning she had sat at it alone in the 14 months since he was gone. She thought about what $450,000 would extract from the lower slope of that hillside, what it would sound like and look like and do to the soil and the watershed below it. Then she thought about what the Brandt homestead actually needed to be what it should be. Not just legally protected, but genuinely preserved, structurally stabilized, properly excavated, equipped for the researchers who had already expressed interest, open to the public in a way that didn't require someone to hike through uncertain terrain without a path. I need to talk to Howard Fisk, she said. And I need a hydrologist I trust to look at where that extraction boundary actually sits relative to the spring drainage. Prentice nodded. He closed the folder. He had not come expecting yes today, she could tell, and he was not performing disappointment at not getting it. One condition before I consider anything further. She kept her voice level. I want Meridian's full geological assessment of this parcel, not a summary, the actual document. Something moved in his expression, brief and controlled. That's proprietary. I know what you're going to tell me. My answer is, if you want me at this table, that document is the cost of entry. You had information I didn't have when I was making decisions about this land. I'm not negotiating blind again. The morning was quiet around them. Outside, somewhere above the barn, the steady movement of the herd. I'll need to get authorization, he said. Get it, she said. I'll call Howard. He left. She stood in the yard and watched the dust settle where his vehicle had been, and felt for the first time in this long negotiation something that was not quite advantage, but was at least a different kind of footing. She was not standing at the edge of anything anymore. She was standing in a place where she had something he needed more than he had anticipated, where the timeline was shifting in her favor, where the question was no longer whether she would survive this, but what kind of agreement, if any, she was willing to make. Those were different questions. She was not used to them yet, but she was learning. Howard's response to the proposal was careful in the particular way. Howard was careful about things he had opinions about, but was disciplined enough not to lead with. They met at the Grover Falls County Historical Society on Friday morning, the long research table between them, the map spread flat with a ceramic coffee mug holding down the corner that kept trying to curl. The boundary they've drawn is legitimate, Howard said, tracing the red line with one finger. Everything above this line is within the designation area. The lower 18 acres is technically outside the primary documentation zone. He took his reading glasses off entirely, which was the gesture he used when he was about to say something he wanted to be heard, without the filter of professional framing. That doesn't mean extraction there has no impact on the site. The spring drainage, the soil hydrology, the visual integrity of the setting. These are things I have the expertise to assess. I'm getting a hydrologist out. June knows someone through the state water office. Good. He looked at the map. Vera, I want to be honest with you about something. Go ahead. $450,000 is real money. The conservation easement they're proposing for the upper parcel, if it's structured correctly, could actually provide stronger long-term protection than the federal designation alone. The National Register prevents federal undertakings from harming the site. A properly written conservation easement prevents private development in perpetuity, regardless of who owns the land or what federal policy might shift. He set his glasses down on the table. I'm not telling you to take the deal. I'm telling you it's not wrong. She sat with that for a moment. You thought I'd fight this all the way. I thought you might. I also think you're smarter than fighting something all the way when there's a version of winning that doesn't require it. She looked at the map. She looked at the red line. She thought about what she actually believed, which was harder than thinking about what she wanted to believe. She believed the cabin mattered. She believed the cemetery mattered. She believed the terracing and the spring and the story of Elias and Miriam Brandt were worth protecting seriously and permanently, with the resources that real protection required. What she was not certain she believed was that the lower 18 acres, the unimproved, undeveloped, historically inert lower slope, where Elias Brandt had never built anything, was worth fighting for as a matter of principle when the fight would cost her the resources to protect what actually mattered. That was uncomfortable to believe. She sat with the discomfort the way you have to sit with things you'd rather not think too clearly about, and let it be what it was. I'm not saying yes, she told Howard. I'm saying I need the hydrologist's report and the full geological document from Meridian before we have anything real to talk about. That's the right answer, he said. The hydrologist's name was Sandra Colby, and she came out on a Tuesday in late August, with equipment Vera didn't recognize and a thoroughness that declared itself in her first 10 minutes on the hillside. She spent 6 hours on the parcel, running water table readings, tracing the spring's drainage path through the subsurface geology, modeling what would happen to the flow under various extraction scenarios. She talked to herself while she worked, a running low-register commentary that Vera caught fragments of without trying to follow. At the end of 6 hours, Sandra sat down on a terrace wall with a bottle of water and her field notebook. The spring is fed from a fracture system in the upper granite, The drainage runs northwest away from the proposed extraction zone, not through. He looked at notes. If they work the lower section using standard mods extraction protocols and on the boundary, the risk to your spring is low, not zero. Low. Define low. Less than 10% probability of meaningful impact based on current data. She turned a page in her notebook. The geology separates cleanly at the line they've drawn. Whoever drew it understood what they were doing. Vera thought about Prentice's map, the generous red line, the buffer wider than necessary. Or they understood what they were protecting. Sandra considered that. Same result either way in this case. That evening, standing at the kitchen window, where the late August light made the Winton Ridge go gold along its upper edge, Vera called Prentice. I want the conservation easement language reviewed by my own attorney before I sign anything. I want extraction noise and dust mitigation requirements written into the agreement, specific limits, not general commitments. I want a remediation bond covering full site restoration if they exceed the boundary. She paused. And I want the funding for the Brant site preservation work paid in advance, not as a future commitment, in advance. A silence on the line with the quality of fast arithmetic being done. The advanced funding for site preservation. What amount? She gave him Howard's number with 15% added for contingency because she had spent enough time around old buildings to know that contingency was not optional. That's manageable, Prentice said, and she heard in those two words, in fact, manageable, and that she probably could have asked for more. And she filed that away. Get me the full geological assessment by Friday. Your attorney can call Howard Fisk about the easement language. We'll talk next week. She hung up and sat at the table in the quiet kitchen. She had not planned any of this. She had bought 55 acres of poison ivy because she needed a spring and had $111. She had sent goats up hillside because June Whitmore mentioned it beside a livestock pen. She had walked into a roofless cabin because she followed a chimney through the brush. She had called Howard Fisk. Patricia Wren suggested it. She had spoken at a county meeting because she didn't know what else to do. The accumulation of those imperfect, half-blind decisions had landed her here, at Dean's table, in a house that was not going to be foreclosed on, in a negotiation with a Denver corporation that needed something from her. She did not feel triumphant. She felt tired in a bone-deep wake and cautious and aware that the deal wasn't done and that things could still go sideways, and also aware, quietly, without fanfare, that she was going to be all right, that the ranch was going to be all right. That was enough for tonight. The National Register designation came through on a Thursday in the first week of September. Howard called at 7:15 in the morning before she had finished first cup of coffee, and she could hear in his voice the specific quality of someone who had been waiting a long time for a particular phone call and was not going to pretend to be calm about receiving it. The keeper signed it, he said. As of this morning, the Brant homestead is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. She put her coffee cup down on Dean's table. It's permanent federal protection. They can challenge it, Meridian or anyone else, but the legal standard for delisting is effectively insurmountable for a site with this level of documentation. A pause. Vera, we did it. She almost corrected him. She stopped. She understood that he meant it collectively, that he was including Patricia and Dr. Summers and Sandra Colby and June, and everyone who had been part of this accumulation that looked from the outside like a strategy, but had been from the inside mostly just refusing to stop. We did it, she said. She went up to the hillside that morning before any other work. Mornings were for the animals, for the cheese cultures, for the 100 things that didn't wait. She went anyway. She stood at the cemetery fence in the September morning light. The light in September in this part of Colorado had a particular quality she had never been able to name. A clarity and angle that summer light didn't have, as if the season had finally finished clearing something from the air. It made the stones look precise and permanent, each letter in the granite reading sharp as the day someone's hands had cut it. National Register, she said to Elias Brandstone. Federal protection. You're not going anywhere. She stood for a while. The valley below was still brown from the drought, but clouds were building to the southwest, the first real formation in 6 weeks, carrying the particular charged pressure that sometimes preceded rain. The goats were in the lower paddock. Franklin was audible somewhere on the far slope, his commentary carrying down through the clear air with its characteristic mixture of urgency and certainty. She drove back down the hill and went to work. The deal with Meridian closed in October. It took 6 weeks of negotiation on the easement language, 2 complete redrafts of the remediation bond, 1 dispute about the extraction boundary definition that required a licensed surveyor on the hillside with both attorneys present, and 1 moment in a conference room in Grover Falls where Prentice said the phrase preservation funding reclassification, and Vera stood up from the table, put on her jacket, and said, "Call me when that changes," and walked out. He called 3 hours later. It changed. She signed the final documents on a Thursday afternoon in a lawyer's office that smelled of carpet cleaner and old coffee. The preservation funding, the full amount in advance, transferred to a joint account controlled by the Grover Falls County Historical Society and Vera Callahan. The conservation easement recorded with the county clerk. The purchase price for the lower 18 acres, $450,000 minus attorney fees that she would be thinking about for some time, arrived in her account 2 business days later. She paid off Piedmont Savings and Loan on a Monday morning. She walked into the bank, sat across from Carla Nash, put a cashier's check on the desk. Carla looked at the check. She looked at Vera. In full? In full. Carla processed the payment with the efficient precision she brought to everything. She printed the paid-in-full confirmation and slid it across the desk. And then she did something that was probably outside the parameters of her professional role, and she did it anyway. I'm glad it worked out. Me too, Vera said. She drove home and put the paid-in-full confirmation in the desk drawer next to the original foreclosure notice. Not for any particular reason. It just seemed like the 2 documents belonged together. The structural stabilization of the cabin began in November. A historic preservation contractor from Pueblo, who had worked on 3 other National Register sites in the region, walked that site on his first day with the attentive recognition of someone who had been doing this long enough to know when he was looking at something uncommon. He told her the original stonework was in better condition than he'd expected. The dry conditions under the vine cover had protected it. With proper stabilization, the walls could stand for another century without significant intervention. She watched him work for a while, which she knew was not efficient, but she did it anyway. The archaeological survey ran through November and into December. The team from the State University worked methodically, grid by grid, and what they found beneath the floorboards of the cabin, sealed under the collapsed loft since sometime in the late 19th century, was a cast iron pot, several hand-forged tools that matched the hardware remnants on the walls, a leather-bound account book in a hand different from the journal entries, and a child's boot. Single, small, hand-stitched. Nobody said much when they found it. The graduate student who uncovered it set her brush down and sat back on her heels and looked at it for a moment, and then she photographed it and marked the grid coordinates and continued, because that was the work. But the boot affected everyone present in the specific way that small objects belonging to dead children always do, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a weight that stayed in the room long after the day's work was done. The leather-bound book went to the conservation lab at the university. The preliminary report came back in January. The account book was not Elias Brandt's. The handwriting was a different, smaller, more deliberate. The hand of someone who had learned to write with more precision than haste. It was Miriam's. What Miriam had recorded in it was not farm accounts. It was a social record. Names, dates, what each family brought, what was shared, who was present. A documented chronicle of the first community gatherings in Sajpflachet Valley, the winter 1864 to 1865. Organized and recorded by Miriam Ruth Brandt, while her husband wrote about the chimney smoke in his journal. Howard called Vera when the report came through. She could hear in his voice the sustained astonishment of a person who has spent their professional life believing that the past gives up what it holds slowly and partially, and who has just been shown he was only half right. Elias gets the credit in the secondary literature because the journal is his, he said. But the community record is hers. She was the one who organized the gatherings. She kept track of who came and what they brought and what they decided. She was building something, Vera, a social fabric. At the same time he was building the physical one. Vera looked out the kitchen window at the western ridge, the snow on the upper elevations now, the lower slopes still that dry winter brown. She thought about the stone. She made it home. Making it home was not one thing. It was not the chimney or the terracing or even the cabin itself. It was Miriam keeping the ledger, writing down who came and what they shared, making a record of the web of connection that turned a collection of isolated homesteads into a valley with a memory of itself. Make sure her name is on the interpretive signage, Vera said. Already planned, Howard said. The first visitors came in the spring before the site was formally open. Word had spread through the academic network and the County Historical Society newsletter, and people began appearing at the gate asking politely if they might walk up to the site. Vera said yes, mostly, as long as they stayed on the marked paths and didn't touch the structures. She found she didn't mind the visitors the way she had expected to. There was something she found unexpectedly moving about watching strangers in the cemetery and go quiet. A woman came on a Saturday in April, driving a car with Nevada plates, perhaps 70 years old, who stood at Elias Brandt's stone for a long time without speaking. When Vera walked over, the woman said without turning around, "My grandmother always told us we had people who went west and never came back. She could never find out where they went." She paused. The name Brandt, we don't know it. But they were neighbors, same county in Missouri. She said they were good people. It's something, Vera said, to find where someone ended up. It is. The woman looked at the stone for another moment. He stayed. He stayed, Vera agreed. She thought about that long afterward. The woman with the Nevada plates and the grandmother who kept the story of neighbors who went west. The way history moved through people sideways and diagonally, and through silences as much as through documents, preserved sometimes in families old on front porches in states, far from where the original thing happened, the names worn down over generations until only the shape of them remained. By summer, 32 months after Dean died, the shape of Vera's life had become something she would not have recognized from the auction room floor. The cattle herd was back to 56 animals, not 91, not yet but solid. The cheese operation was producing 60 pounds a week, with a waiting list from 3 restaurants in Grover Falls and 1 in Pueblo. She had hired a young woman named Cass Eldridge part-time in April, who showed up exactly when she said she would and asked good questions and listened to the answers, which Vera had come to understand was rarer than it should be. The goats numbered 48. Franklin was alive, impossible, and still finding fence gaps that defied rational explanation. She had moved entirely past philosophy about it into something closer to acceptance of a fundamental condition of the universe. Some things were simply true. She walked the full parcel on a morning in late June, all 55.4 acres of it, from boundary to boundary without fighting through a foot of overgrowth anywhere. The transformation was complete enough that it was difficult to remember the wall of green that had sealed this place away 2 years ago. The trail was finished, winding up from the small parking area off the county road through the lower section, across the terraces, past the stabilized cabin walls, ending at the cemetery fence. The interpretive signage was in place, solid oak panels with engraved text that Patricia Wren had spent 3 weeks getting exactly right, reading every draft with the focused attention of someone who understood that word set permanently into wood could not be unmade. The first panel at the trailhead, Brant Homestead, established 1861. This site preserves the earliest documented permanent settlement in the upper Clearbone Creek Valley. Elias and Miriam Brant built here in the year Colorado was not yet a state, and their lives in the community they helped build are the foundation on which this valley stands. Vera stopped and read it. She had read it a dozen times during the installation process. Something about seeing it fixed in oak, permanent and public, made it settle differently than it had settled on paper or on a screen. She walked up to the cemetery. The fence had been repaired, the iron cleaned, the worn wire replaced where it had gone past saving. The stones themselves she had refused to have professionally cleaned or repositioned. The wear on them was part of what they were. She crouched at Elias Brant's stone. She pulled a clump of grass that was pushing under the base, was not the kind of thing you were supposed to do at a National Register site. Probably. She did it anyway. She had been tending this particular piece of ground for 2 years, and that relationship didn't reclassify itself because its federal agency had weighed in on the property. She heard voices below on the trail. She straightened and looked down the slope. 2 adults moving at the careful pace of people paying attention to where they put their feet on new terrain. A child between them, moving faster than either of them, the easy forward momentum of someone not yet convinced that the world requires caution. The child was a girl, perhaps 8 years old, wearing a yellow jacket so bright it caught the morning light from 20 meters away. She reached the first interpretive panel before the adults caught up and stood in front of it with the effortful concentration of a child who has recently become proud of what she can read and is not going to rush past anything. Vera watched her. The girl read the whole panel, moving her lips slightly on the harder words. When she finished, she turned around and called out something to the adults behind her, her voice carrying up the slope in the clear morning air. Vera couldn't make out the words at this distance, only the tone, the unmistakable register of a child who has found out something she thinks is important and cannot wait to tell someone. The adults arrived. They stood together at the panel, all 3 of them, and the girl pointed at something on the wood and spoke, and the adults nodded and asked questions back, and the girl answered with the authority of the person who read it first, who got there first, who knows. Vera turned away. She gave them their moment with it, because that was what the site was for now, not for her alone, but for people who came up this trail and stood at these stones and understood something about where they were that they hadn't understood when they parked the car. She had built the thing, or helped build it, or stumbled into building it, and now it belonged to more than her in a way that required her to hold on and let go at the same time, which was the particular discipline of people who make things that outlast the making. She walked back down the trail toward the parking area. She had morning chores, a cheese batch to check, a call with Howard about the summer programming calendar, a fence on the north pasture she had been meaning to get to for 2 weeks. Franklin was audible from somewhere on the slope above her as she reached the trailhead, his commentary carrying down through the morning air with its characteristic mixture of urgency and certainty, which was Franklin's approach to every situation he had ever encountered. She got in the truck. She drove down the hill with the window open, the warm June air moving through, and she thought about what Elias Brandt had written in his journal about the morning the first fire burned in the new chimney, about Miriam in the doorway, about the smoke rising. The hill is breathing. This is ours now. She had understood those words differently at various moments since she first read them. In February, she had understood them as possession, the claiming of a place. In March, standing in the vicinity for the first time, she had understood them as grief made habitable, the way people convert loss into belonging by staying long enough. Now, coming down the hill past the trailhead and the parking area with its small sign directing visitors and the tire tracks of a Nevada-plated car still faintly visible in the soft ground, she understood them as something else entirely. A hill breathing is not owned. It is inhabited. There is a difference, and the difference is everything, and the people who have understood that difference have always been the ones who lasted. She drove home through the valley in the ordinary light of an ordinary June morning in a place that was, because of what had been found here and what had been kept, no longer quite ordinary at all and would not be again.